When discussion about the sequel trilogy being decanonized comes up, defenders usually only use the prequels and their hatred as the justification. But they never bring up the expanded universe, and if they do, they just make cookie-cutter statements about how it was never canon, blah 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 blah. Well, that needs to stop. YouTuber Captain Fordo has already made a video on the subject, but I'm going to give my own explanation, proving that narrative wrong, and show that sequel fans are just ignoring the expanded universe, given they were the sort of people that celebrated its disregardal by Disney. This will be a shorter and thereby more accessible version of Captain Fordo's video. The most obvious way of proving the expanded universe's canonicity status is by Disney themselves explaining very publicly that they were making it non-canon. So the company that made the sequels in the first place supports the idea that the expanded universe was at one point canon through their own announcement. When sequel fans use George Lucas to defend the sequels, it's usually out of context, misleading evidence or quotes shown in a certain way, and certainly cherry-picked or ignored for their own agenda. As an actual example, in my video about Pauper memes and the sequels being decanonized, he actually responded to my video and pulled a bunch of random quotes from George Lucas. And of course, a lot of them are cherry-picked. And of course, he failed to realize that if the expanded universe isn't canon by his argumentation, then neither is the sequels. If you're going to argue that George Lucas defines canonicity, then you must hold the sequels to the same standard. But of course, they also make excuses like how Lucas liked The Last Jedi, which I haven't actually seen a single quote for that beyond Lucas making the vague statement that it was beautifully made. Sequel fans are so selfish. They don't care about the 30 plus years of content that had to be thrown away to make way for their inferior copy-paste nostalgia bait scams of the original trilogy. The excuse they make is just that it was never canon, which is false, but by their own standards, neither is the sequels. Back to Pauper memes, I discussed the validity of the quotes with Ironinquisitor, and he instantly spattered back by telling me they were out of context or misinterpreted. Let's go through the first two quotes Pauper memes gave me. The first quote is completely cherry-picked and not the full quote. Here is the actual full quote.
Do you supervise the development of all the off-movie stories? After all, Star Wars exists in books, comics. You know, I try not to think about that. I have my own world in movies and I follow it. Of course, that the people who expand this universe work for me. But I can't follow up all that they produce.
Essentially what he's saying is that the expanded universe is something he doesn't keep constant track of. Anyone who knows how much George Lucas makes entertainment, at least back then, knows that he was really busy. The only time he wasn't busy was post-2012 when he retired. The second quote misses the mark so much. Leland Chi, keeper of the Holocron, which is basically the continuity management department, responded to Lucas's quote and said himself,
"Parallel universe suggests that each universe can go in separate directions, which really isn't the case with regard to the EU. The EU is bound by what is seen in the most current version of the films and by directives from George Lucas."
So basically people thought a parallel universe meant a separate universe. Leland Chi has disputed the confusion. George Lucas's stance is already elaborated in this quote I'm about to show you.
He knows the comics very well. After the fact, he reads the comics. George knows more about Star Wars than we do. He doesn't see the expanded universe as his Star Wars, but as ours. I think this has been mentioned previously, maybe in other places, but it's not new info as far as I remember.
George Lucas himself was an avid collaborator in the expanded universe. Stuff from the comics, including Ayla Secura, the Blue Twilight Jedi, did not originate from Attack of the Clones, but rather the Star Wars Republic comics. The expanded universe absolutely coexisted with his vision. Let me put it like this. The expanded universe as a whole wasn't part of his specific vision for Star Wars, but it was canon because it worked with his vision and was made under him with his approval and supervision. If George Lucas didn't like an idea, he would reject it. For example, you guys remember Star Wars 1313? Well, the cancelled game was going to have a new character in the Coruscant underworld. But George Lucas changed his mind and said it would be about Boba Fett. And the developers were forced to change it, which set them back immensely, because they were supposed to announce the game months away, and now they had to change it. Do you think that if George Lucas didn't care about the expanded universe or continuity, that he would have been a massive roadblock on the project? Like, it's true to say George Lucas can be stubborn and change his mind, but the one thing he didn't change on was the expanded universe. He always considered it a parallel universe to his story. There are countless examples of expanded universe content that made it into the Star Wars movies. In the special edition of Star Wars A New Hope, a ship from the video game Shadows of the Empire can be seen. That business on Canon Nemoidia that didn't count according to Obi-Wan was referencing the novel Labyrinth of Evil, a prequel novel that came out before Revenge of the Sith. So with that being said, the expanded universe definitely coexisted equally with George Lucas's movies. To elaborate, the films were core canon and everything else was secondary. They actually hierarched content for the longest time. George Lucas canon was at the top, and stories with the Infinities label were at the very bottom. So when it comes to TCW that retconned pretty much everything, George Lucas was usually misguided by Dave Filoni on how episodes would be structured. For example, Dave Filoni in the featurettes talking about the arc where Ahsoka leaves the Jedi Order says that he snuck the structure of the episode to George so that he could make sure Ahsoka lived. George personally wanted Ahsoka to die, and we also have to keep in mind that because of stupid online prequel hate, George Lucas was burnt out and working on other stuff, like Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and Red Tails. And Dave Filoni was the opposite of a hardcore Star Wars nerd. He knew very little about the expanded universe, aside from the mainstream stuff like the games. But even then he got stuff from the games wrong. For example, he featured Delta Squad in a Clone Wars episode, but disregarded the Republic Commando novels. It was pretty much just a fun cameo they threw in. And also, Dave Filoni featured Onderon from Knights of the Old Republic too. But given the game was probably his only source, and he got a lot of the lore wrong. And I mean a lot. He got the look of Onderon wrong, plus he cut out the moon of Duxon, which was a location you actually went to alongside Onderon in KOTOR 2. I'm also sure there's other shit, but that's the basis of it. I'll talk about this more when I get around talking to the Clone Wars show again, but for now, just remember, Dave Filoni knows little about Star Wars as a whole. People try to use Dave Filoni's thoughts on The Last Jedi to say that the film is good, but given Dave Filoni's an overrated hack, that means nothing to me. Chris Avellone, the lead designer of KOTOR 2, is a writer I respect infinitely more, and his public statement on The Last Jedi was that he disliked it, although he thought it had its moments, which is kinder than the film deserves honestly, but that's his opinion. Another story I'd like to use is Tales of the Jedi. It was originally going to be focused on Anakin Skywalker, but George Lucas, who wanted to make the prequels, stopped them in their tracks and told them to make it about ancient Jedi instead. So that's what they did. I mean, if George Lucas didn't consider the EU canon, then why would he have to step in to stop the Tales of the Jedi writers? After all, isn't the expanded universe non-canon after all? I have a feeling in an alternate universe where the Tales of the Jedi comics were made the way they originally were supposed to be, and George Lucas still makes the prequels, jackasses like Red Letter Media would be like, "Oh, look at Tales of the Jedi. That story had a completely different Anakin Skywalker, and it was way better than Lucas's fanfiction trash." Knowing prequel haters, they definitely would have done that. On a final note, Disney can't even keep their own continuity straight. It's been shown that they put movies, shows, and games above novels and comics. So all this expanded universe not being canon nonsense better applies to Disney's canon. I mean, I'm 80% sure that Star Wars Eclipse is going to ignore the High Republic novels that have come out so far. Or they'll override it. So that's the expanded universe's actual role in Star Wars, and George Lucas's vision explained. On a final note, Here are some additional quotes that set the record straight. Also, thanks to Ironinquisitor for narrating the quotes that debunk these misconceptions. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories about mystery boxes?
We found you hiding, we found you lying, choking on the dirt and sand. Your former glories and all your stories, dragged and washed with eager hands. But oh,